Here's something that will change how you understand Caribbean history. One of the only African-descended communities in the Western Hemisphere to win formal sovereign treaty rights from a European colonial power through military force is in the mountains of Jamaica. While every other African diaspora population across the Americas spent centuries being absorbed into colonial demographic structures, one community was not. Their DNA still traces, with a precision that Caribbean genetics rarely achieves, to specific Akan-speaking ethnic communities on the Gold Coast of West Africa. The same people, the same coastal tradition, the same bloodlines. So the question is not where the Jamaican Maroons came from. The genome answers that directly. The question is how they kept what every other community in the Atlantic world was forced to lose. And that answer runs through some of the most morally complicated chapters in Caribbean colonial history. The Jamaican Maroons are not one community. They are two: the Leeward Maroons of the Cockpit country in western Jamaica, and the Windward Maroons of the Blue Mountains in the east. Together they represent something that should not have been able to survive the conditions it survived in: a free African-descended community inside a British plantation colony that produced more sugar wealth per acre than almost anywhere else in the Atlantic world. While every mechanism of the plantation system was designed to destroy exactly the kind of identity the Maroons preserved, the mountains held. And the reason the mountains held is not a story of resistance alone, though resistance is the center of it. It is a story of geology, biology, and a specific military tradition that the colonizers importing enslaved people from West Africa were also, without knowing it, importing the capacity to defeat. The founding names are the first piece of evidence the genome is reading from. The leaders of the Leeward Maroon community, who would eventually negotiate the 1739 peace treaty, were named Cudjo, Akampong, Cuffy, and Johnny. The first three are Akan day names from present-day Ghana. Cudjo is the Akan name for a boy born on Monday. Cuffy is the name for a boy born on Friday. Akampong traces directly to the Akan name Akayampong and carries the spiritual weight of the supreme creator deity, a name drawn from traditions the Gold Coast communities practiced long before any British ship appeared on their horizon. These names do not tell you that the founding community was generically West African. They tell you which specific cultural and linguistic tradition those men came from. The haplogroup data in modern Maroon DNA confirms what the names already said. The Akan connection is traceable. The founding origin is not a general attribution. It is a specific address. The Cockpit country is the second piece of evidence, and I found it harder to describe than I expected. The Cockpit country is a geological formation created by karst limestone terrain. Hundreds of steep-sided sinkholes, each one a natural defensive position, covered in subtropical forest that collapses sound and obscures movement. British military columns that entered it consistently lost their sense of direction, lost contact with each other, became vulnerable to ambush from positions they could not locate. The Maroons had spent years mapping every sinkhole, every ridgeline, every approach. The British were operating in terrain they could not read against an enemy who had memorized it. Every military expedition that entered the Cockpit country returned with casualties and without a decisive engagement. The terrain that the plantation economy had no interest in was the precise terrain that made defeating the Maroons impossible. The Windward Maroons in the Blue Mountains had a different geography and a different founding leadership. Queen Nanny, one of Jamaica's 7 official national heroes, appearing on the $500 bill, almost certainly Ashanti or Fonte, enslaved and transported to Jamaica, escaped into the Blue Mountains, became the political and spiritual leader of the Windward community at a fortification called Nanny Town in the mountain ridge. The Ashanti connection is not background detail. The Ashanti were the most militarily sophisticated people in West Africa. They successfully resisted British colonial military campaigns in Ghana for the entire 19th century, only formally coming under British colonial authority in 1902. The specific guerrilla tactics attributed to Nanny, ambush from concealment, the ability to appear and disappear without engaging at disadvantage, the psychological warfare that made British soldiers describe fighting the Maroons as fighting ghosts, reflect a military tradition the Ashanti had been developing in the Ghanaian forest region for generations. The plantation system imported the knowledge that would defeat it. 2 instruments made the Maroon military system work in ways the British could not counter. I did not fully understand either of them before following this evidence. The Abeng is a cow horn used for long-distance communication across mountain terrain. Different sequences of blasts carried specific military intelligence. The number of approaching soldiers, their direction, whether they were a scouting party or a full column. The system worked across the Cockpit country's steep terrain in conditions that made visual signals impossible. The British had no equivalent system and no way to decode the messages. Every military campaign against the leeward Maroons was preceded by an intelligence network the British did not know existed. What the British terrifiedly recorded as Obia, but what the Maroons themselves guarded as Mile, or Kromanti science, a protective spiritual tradition developed from West African religious practice, served a specific military function that goes far beyond the famous story of Queen Nanny catching bullets, making fighters genuinely believe they were spiritually protected from British weapons produced measurable battlefield consequences. Soldiers who believe they cannot be killed fight differently than soldiers who believe they can. The British military reports from the period document their soldiers' psychological terror in the face of Maroon fighters who seem to survive situations that should have been lethal. The Abeng carried the intelligence. The Obia carried the will to act on it. The British lost enough soldiers and enough money that by 1739 the colonial government calculated negotiation was cheaper than continued military failure. The First Maroon War ended not because the Maroons were defeated. It ended because the British could not defeat them and decided a treaty was more economically rational than an unwinnable war. The ceremony that sealed the treaty on March 1st, 1739 between Cudjoe and Captain John Guthrie did not follow British diplomatic protocol. It followed Akan covenant ritual. The agreement was completed through the mixing of blood and rum, drunk by both parties from the same vessel. Cudjoe's gesture of kneeling and embracing Guthrie's knees was recorded by the British as submission. In the Akan tradition, it signified a specific form of recognition between parties of different status, not inferior acknowledging superior, but warrior acknowledging the terms of an equal agreement. A British colonial officer participated in an Akan ritual to end a war his military had been losing for a decade. Both parties left the ceremony believing they had won. The specific disagreement about what was actually agreed is why the treaty is still being litigated in Jamaican courts today. The treaty gave the Maroon communities freedom, territorial sovereignty over specific mountain lands, and the right to self-governance. I want to stay on that for a moment, because what it required in return is the part most accounts of Maroon history skip past. In exchange for freedom and sovereignty, the Maroon communities agreed to capture and return escaped enslaved people to their colonial owners. The community that had escaped slavery, that had fought for a decade to preserve its freedom, that had built an autonomous mountain society as a refuge from the plantation system, signed a legal agreement to send escaped enslaved people back to that system. The historical record confirms that some people were returned. Not all Maroon communities enforced this clause equally. Not all Maroon leaders interpreted it the same way, but the clause existed and it was used. The moral framework within which this decision was made is not simple. The Maroon leaders were negotiating survival for their specific communities against a military power that had been trying to destroy them for a decade. The treaty preserved the freedom of the people already free at the cost of denying it to those who were not. What the DNA records is the structural consequence. 3 centuries of mountain endogamy that the treaty's territorial sovereignty made possible, producing a genome that preserved its West African ancestry at concentrations the plantation system was diluting everywhere else in the Caribbean. The treaty held for 56 years before the British found a reason to break it. In 1795, a group of Trelawney Town Maroons, a community related to Cudjoe's Leeward Maroons, rebelled after 2 of their members were publicly flogged for stealing pigs. The Second Maroon War lasted 8 months. The British eventually imported Cuban bloodhounds and Cuban military trackers, the only people they could find who understood how to pursue an enemy through terrain similar to the Cockpit country, and launched a sustained campaign that the terrain alone could not stop indefinitely. The Trelawney Town Maroons agreed to surrender on a specific stated condition. They would be guaranteed return to their lands once the situation was resolved. The British colonial governor confirmed the promise in writing. The promise was broken within weeks of the surrender. Approximately 600 Trelawney Town Maroons, men, women, and children, were loaded onto ships at Kingston Harbour in 1796 and transported to Halifax, Nova Scotia. I have not been able to read that specific betrayal, a written promise, broken within weeks to people who had surrendered specifically on the basis of that promise, without stopping since the first time I encountered the documents. They spent 4 years in Halifax in conditions for which nothing in their Jamaican mountain experience had prepared them. In 1800, they were transported again, this time to Sierra Leone, where the British were establishing the crown colony of Freetown as a settlement for formerly enslaved and recaptured African people. The Trelawney Town Maroons who arrived in Freetown joined the Nova Scotian settlers, formerly enslaved people who had been promised freedom by the British during the American Revolution and had been living in Halifax since 1792. These two communities, both displaced from different directions, both carrying partial British promises, became together the founding populations of the Creole people of present-day Sierra Leone. A DNA chain connects the Cockpit country in western Jamaica through Halifax, Nova Scotia to Freetown on the West African coast. The Trelawney Town deportees completed a reverse middle passage in 3 movements across 3 continents in 4 years. Their descendants in Freetown carry a specific genetic signature that traces to Jamaican mountain communities, that traces to Akan-speaking coastal Ghana. The full triangle has never been documented as a single story in any documentary format. The genome connects all 3 points simultaneously. The DNA evidence for the communities that remained in Jamaica is where the preservation argument becomes specific and measurable. Modern genetic studies of Akan Town and Moore Town show what 3 centuries of mountain endogamy produced biologically. The Maroon communities carry higher proportions of West African ancestry than the broader Jamaican population. The specifically Akan-affiliated haplogroup signals appear at elevated frequencies consistent with a founding population drawn heavily from Ashanti and Fonte-speaking people. The European ancestry component is measurably lower than the Jamaican average, reflecting the structural consequence of the treaty's territorial sovereignty. 3 centuries of mountain isolation that kept outside genetic input limited in ways that were impossible in the plantation communities below. And the Maroons preserved something inside the isolation that is, in its own way, as extraordinary as the genome itself. Kromanti play is a sacred ceremonial language still used in spiritual rituals in Akan Town and Moore Town today. Linguists who have documented it trace specific words, tonal patterns, and grammatical structures directly to Twi and Fonte from present-day Ghana. It is not an everyday language. It is a spiritual register, used in healing ceremonies, in ancestor invocations, in the calling of warrior spirits, maintained specifically as a sacred technology, rather than as daily speech. This is why it survived when other African language retentions across the Caribbean did not. The Maroon communities preserved Kromanti play because it was ritually necessary, not because it was convenient. The language the British tried to replace with English survived inside the ceremonies the British could not enter. What the genome has become in recent years is the part of this story that the Gula-Geechee parallel makes precise. In 2017, the Jamaican government approved bauxite mining operations in the Cockpit country, the specific terrain that Cudjo's community had used to defeat British military campaigns for decades. The Akan Maroon community filed a legal challenge citing the 1739 treaty. The argument was not based on contemporary land rights law. It was based on a 285-year-old document that guaranteed territorial sovereignty over specific mountain lands. Legal proceedings are ongoing. The same mechanism the Gula-Geechee Nation brought to international human rights hearings, the genome as documentation of unbroken presence, the linguistic record as evidence of cultural continuity. The Jamaican Maroon community is bringing to Jamaican courts in the form of a blood oath treaty. When you stand before a court and argue that your people have a right to remain on their ancestral mountain land, the evidence that your genome has been in those specific mountains for 300 years without interruption is not a metaphor. It is documentation of the same kind. The acknowledgement that that documentation represents has been arriving in pieces. The Akan Maroon Day celebration on January 6th draws diaspora Jamaicans from New York, London, and Toronto to the Cockpit country each year. The $500 Jamaican bill carries Queen Nanny's face. The academic literature on Maroon history has grown substantially in the last 2 decades. The mining permit challenge is still active. What has not been fully acknowledged is the scale of what the genome is recording. The Akan haplogroup signals, the Kromanti play ritual language, the blood oath ceremony that sealed a treaty in 1739 using an African ritual rather than a British one, the Sierra Leone DNA chain connecting the Cockpit country to Freetown through Halifax, the specific windward and leeward community divergence producing measurably different profiles across 30 miles of Jamaican mountain terrain. The genome of the Jamaican Maroon communities is not a single archive. It is several archives happening simultaneously, all of them recording the same decision: to stay free and to stay specific about what that freedom meant, across 3 centuries of a British colonial system that had every incentive to make that decision impossible. If you carry Jamaican ancestry and opened a DNA result with a West African ancestry percentage that runs higher than you expected, this is probably part of why. If you have family stories about mountain communities that stop at a specific generation without explanation, the treaty and the communities it protected may be where the explanation lives. The Maroon genome is in Jamaica. It is in New York and London and Toronto, with every Jamaican diaspora family that descended from the mountain communities. It is in Freetown, Sierra Leone, with the descendants of the Trelawney town deportees. The blood oath sealed in 1739 produced a biological and cultural archive that the British colonial system spent a century and a half trying to undo and never fully managed. Drop what stayed with you in the comments. If you know someone carrying Jamaican or Caribbean ancestry with questions the standard historical narrative does not answer, send this to them. There's more in this record than I have found yet, and I'm not finished looking. Thanks for watching.